The cultural expectation is that women will be communal and warm and think about what is in everyone's best interest. And our expectation of a leader is that they will be assertive, driving, and able to advocate for themselves. Those two things are on a collision course, where what we expect of women and what we expect of leaders are diametrically opposed. So that if a woman acts the way we expect a woman to act, people might like her, but they won't see her as a leader. And if women act the way we expect a leader to act, then people may see her as a leader, but they won't like her.
You're listening to Alicia Menendez on Psychologists Off the Clock.
We are 4 clinical psychologists here to bring you cutting-edge and science-based ideas from psychology to help you flourish in your relationships, work, and health.
I'm Dr. Debbie Sorensen, practicing in Mile High, Denver, Colorado.
I'm Dr. Diana Hill, practicing in Seaside, Santa Barbara, California.
From coast to coast, I'm Dr. Elle Schoenbrunn, a Boston-based clinical psychologist and assistant professor at Brown University.
And from sunny San Diego, I'm Dr. Jill Stoddard, author of Be Mighty and the Big Book of Act Metaphors.
We hope you take what you learn here to build a rich and meaningful life.
Thank you for listening to Psychologists Off the Clock.
I'm so excited to announce that my book, Be Mighty, is going to be featured in a virtual book club with High Tide. So if you would like to be part of a community of learners where you can work through brief exercises together in their really cool, easy to use app, and you'd like to have 2 live, intimate chats with me, you can check out Be Mighty with High Tide. And if you go to offtheclockpsych.com and go to our sponsor page, you can sign up there and get a 15% off discount coupon. So check it out.
We're also affiliates with Dr. Rick Hansen's online Neurodharma program and his Foundations of Wellbeing programs. And you can find out more about them at our website, offtheclockpsych.com, where you'll get a $40 discount. I also want to say just a little plug for our podcast. Help us out by making a donation on Patreon. It's a values-based donation. We put a lot of blood, sweat, and tears and into these episodes. And we need some support to keep the podcast going, because for it to be financially sustainable as we grow, we need a little bit more support to do all of the behind the scenes stuff. So check out Patreon and please make a values-based donation.
Hey everyone, I am here to introduce this episode today with Elle, and I had the honor of interviewing Alicia Menendez, who is just incredible. She does so much. She's an anchor for MSNBC. She hosts a podcast called Latina to Latina. The Washington Post called her Miss Millennial. She's been called journalism's new gladiator by Elle and a content queen by Marie Claire. And she's had interviews and reporting appearing all over the place, like ABC News and Bustle, FusionTV, PBS, Vice News. I know she's been a guest on The View, as we talk about in the episode. And today we're going to talk primarily about her incredible book, The Likeability Trap. And I was so excited to have Alicia on, not only because I loved this book, and I think part of the reason I loved it so much is it just spoke to me in terms of its relatability as a professional woman, and how often we find ourselves in these traps, these like damned if you do, damned if you don't kind of traps, where in order to be successful, women need to be likable. All the research says women are expected to be likable in a way that is not expected of men. And if we're not likable, there really is a penalty for this. And it's sort of exhausting having to always try to find this space where, we're being assertive enough that we're making sure we have a voice and a seat at the table, but not too assertive that people are going to think we're being aggressive or bitchy. And then we become unlikable, and then that impacts our ability to succeed. And she just talks about all of these issues in this book in a really just well thought out, well reasoned, compelling sort of way. So I'm curious what your thoughts were, Elle.
I love this interview, and a huge reason why I loved it is something that you guys actually talked a lot about, which is that it was so authentic. Both of you shared your personal experience and some of the specific dilemmas that you've been in, both personally and professionally, when it comes to how you manage this push and pull between being likable and being ambitious, being likable, and being assertive. And I know that for you, Jill, like authenticity is a really top value. And it is for me too. And the reason is that that's how I connect to people, right? When I really feel like people are being genuine and sharing their hearts with me and open to me, that's how I feel connected. That's how I feel seen. That's how I sort of feel known and that I can know. And it is really complicated for women, especially in the professional space. But as you guys talked about, also in the family space, it can be really complicated to be authentic and to develop those deep relationships when there is this double-edged sword of feeling like the more that you show different parts of yourself that may be judged because you're a woman, that you may be off-putting. And so it really is a complicated place to be. And it really does limit how you can show up in an authentic way. And it's just interesting to be thinking about these things because I'm reading a memoir called Know My Name by Chanel Miller that I know that you've read. And she talks a lot about that as a young woman growing into her sexual self and going out to parties, that there's this real double bind of being authentic and just showing up in a playful way, but also needing to have a witness and be really careful and not wear your hair in a ponytail or say anything that's too sexually provocative. And then similarly, I was reading this article that I was sharing with you today, Jill, about Black women's suffrage and how Ida B. Wells, who's I think better known for her journalistic professional activity, but also did a lot of work in helping Black women get the vote, even after women technically legally had the vote. And her granddaughter just recently released a book where she talks about how Ida Wells was really in a bind between being likable and really helping to propel Black women's suffrage forward. And so this is clearly a longstanding issue for women of many racial and ethnic backgrounds. And I just think it's such an important conversation. And you and Alicia Menendez really just made it come to life in such an important way.
I'm so glad. And what that makes me think about too is when I think of other women who have been vilified for being assertive, I think of Anita Hill, I think of Christine Blasey Ford, where they were really kind of fighting a battle on their own. And there was clearly a lot of pushback for them. But when you look at the Me Too movement and the Time's Up movement, I think where we have a lot of power is in groups and in numbers. And I even know for myself in my own personal experience that where I get the courage to be authentic, to share my successes, even though I feel really anxious that I'm not being humble and people won't like me if they see me as bragging, the courage to do that comes from having cheerleaders like you and Diana and Debbie and the women's groups that I belong to, the writing group that I belong to, that I find the more I surround myself with other women who also are ambitious and want to be genuine, who care about these issues, it really helps, I think, all of us to move forward in these ways, even though there is that fear and reality of the potential penalty for doing so. And Alicia talks about that in her book, and we didn't get to talk about it much in the episode, but I do think it's one of the really critical pieces of how we can move the needle forward.
That reminds me of the book that you've been encouraging me to read, Abby Wambach's Wolfpack, which I know talks a lot about how women can really come together to support each other and raise each other up. And that really is an experience that we have in this podcast. And it's not easy or, seamless, but I think, the more that we try to be talking about these kinds of issues and really not allowing the status quo to just remain what it's been for so long, that we can make forward progress. And that's why, again, I think the conversation and Alicia Menendez's book is so important. And the timing is just so right to be pushing this conversation forward.
Absolutely. So guys, check out Alicia's book and enjoy this episode. Hey everyone, it's Jill here, and I am super excited. I have Alicia Menendez with me today, and when I started on the podcast back in January, she was the very first person that I really wanted to interview, and we've gone back and forth for a couple months, and finally made it happen. So I'm super excited to have her today. Thank you so much, and welcome to Psychologists Off the Clock.
Jill, I'm so glad we finally made this happen. And I'm covering my face because it should not have taken 6 months, but here we are.
Well, I want to talk primarily about your book, The Likeability Trap. I don't remember where I found it, how I stumbled upon it, but it just, I don't know, it hit me like a ton of bricks. I just love this book. And I hope everyone after this interview runs right out and reads it as well. So tell me a little bit about your story. Like, how did you come to write this book? Were there personal experiences? I mean, you went to Harvard undergrad, so I imagine there were some things that occurred there. Like, what were some of the things that influenced your desire to write about gender and success?
I originally wanted to write a book that was going to be like an eat, pray, love for likability, where I, as a person who cares a lot about how others perceive me, how I make others feel, would recognize the downsides of that and, go to a yoga retreat, eat gelato, and try to free myself of what I perceive as something that really at this point holds me back. And what I found as I started talking to other women, particularly other professional women, particularly women in male-dominated fields, is that there were women like me who cared a lot and they paid an internal price for caring. But there were also women who did not care at all, or at least weren't governed by what other people think of them. And those women, too, felt that they were paying a price for being so brazenly themselves and having disregard for the expectation that women should care about what others think of them. And that became much more interesting to me than my original question, right? That it wasn't as though this was just an internal process. This was an external expectation that really had to be reckoned with. And so that became the core question. To your point about the sort of launch incident in my own life, I found it really challenging to pick just one, in part because this desire is so deeply ingrained in me. I think it's culturally ingrained in me the way it is in a lot of women, in a lot of sensitive people, in a lot of high achievers. But where it started, the friction started to come up for me was that I have this career in broadcast journalism. I am a public person. And so I would do things like go on The View. Just like a lifelong dream to be on The View. I think it's like a very common dream for a lot of people. And the advice that everyone would give me was like, well, just be yourself. Just be yourself. And because I am someone who shapes and shifts to very often accommodate whoever I'm with, I was like, well, I don't know that I know who that is. I don't know that I have such a fixed sense of self that I know how to show up as one person rather than being a person or being who I am in relation to others. And so that experience of being on that show and the lights being on and everyone being like, do you? And being like, like almost 30 at that point. I have no idea who that is. That to me is the closest I can come to identifying a catapult moment.
That's so interesting because, now that I'm thinking about this as you're talking, I think something similar is what really drew me to the book, which is, for me, one of my most important personal values is authenticity. And in my clients, as a clinical psychologist, in my clients, I find that this is a common personal value as well. And that it's something that myself and my female clients tend to struggle with most. And it's not just about who am I? What does it mean to be authentic, like you're saying? But I feel like when I'm authentic, there are some costs to that, right? Like there's this part of me that does all this people pleasing and accommodating, and that gets reinforced. And then when I try to be more authentic, which might mean being assertive or saying something someone doesn't want to hear, or maybe like not being humble, like maybe I'm going to tell the world about some of my successes, that there are negative consequences to that. And not that that means it's not worth doing, but it's this double bind, which of course is, what the book is about.
And that we're just not honest about that. There are a lot of Instagram memes that I saved to my phone that I hope will just by osmosis change me, right? Like, do you and don't care what anybody else thinks, or, any quote about authenticity, because it rarely captures the other side, which is we live in a society and a culture, and we have relationships where there will be penalties, right? Where it's like, if you speak up in your office or in your workplace about a problem, very often for women, and especially women of color, we become the problem, right? That people say like, oh, like, is this really a problem, or is she being difficult? And that, I think, complicates the picture. At the same time that we're shouting at people, be yourself, do yourself, be authentic. It's like, okay, but then we have to be honest about the fact that you have to create environments and workplaces where people can do that, not be penalized for it, be rewarded for it, and where we are all agreeing that we are comfortable dealing with then the expansion, the cultural expansion that needs to happen to allow that to be possible.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, what's happening in politics right now is bringing that a little bit more to the forefront. It's creating more of a conversation around the expectations for candidates to be likable. We've heard Kamala Harris was being accused. Oh, she didn't apologize after she had a debate, I believe, was the criticism there. Someone else was being criticized for being too ambitious. I mean, these ridiculous standards.
They were both Kamala. Poor Kamala.
Were they both Kamala? Yeah. I mean, things that you never hear being said about male candidates. And the fact that it's happening, I think, is causing people to talk about these things more.
It's funny because I was on MSNBC, where I work, talking about both of those attacks that have been launched against Kamala Harris. And then, of course, on Twitter, there's the secondary conversation where people are like, but that's the same for men, right? Men have to be likable too if they want to run for office. And it's not the same. I mean, there's all of this research that shows that, yes, while voters in general prefer a likable candidate, they will vote for a man they don't like as long as they believe that he is competent. Where a woman has to clear both hurdles. A woman has to prove that she is competent, and then she also has to convince a voter that they like her. And what gets so messy for women candidates, for professional women, is that in proving our competence, we inherently become less likable. And that can take a variety of forms. It can take the form of a straight A STEM student having the perception that she is like not fun because she clearly is so committed to her work. It can have the effect of a woman just being very assertive and very able to direct and lead a team, and that conflicting with the expectation we have of women. So what I find so interesting about women candidates is what happens to women in the workplace is often very subtle, and it often happens in things that are unsaid. And so with politicians, we are literally asked for our opinions of them. We are asked in public polling. We are asked in focus groups. Pundits go on television and talk about it. And so I watch it through the lens of, these are the things they say about all women when we're not in the room.
Yeah, absolutely. I was reading an article recently that talks about these exact things that you and I are talking about. And there's a woman, I'm forgetting her name, but she's at a law school in California, and she talks about it as gender judo. And this idea that as women, we can be more assertive as long as we're also warm, right? That like will allow you to have some of these characteristics that are seen as more male dominant that women shouldn't have, as long as you layer on top of it these more feminine characteristics. And then maybe you'll exist in this tiny little bubble where we'll accept you as being both likable and competent. It's exhausting.
I think that advice comes from Joan Williams, who has done a lot of work in this space. And I, in the process of writing the Likeability Trap, really try to be fair about the fact that is good advice for survival and necessary. And I also believe that each person, each woman needs to do what she needs to do in order to survive and thrive in her workplace. And that is so specific to who you are and your workplace that there are very few blanket pieces of advice that are just going to work for everybody, because being a psychologist is very different than being a journalist. And you are very different than me, because we're just different people. And at the same time, it sort of underlined for me what I think has become so limited about the work that has been done around women in work, which is that the last wave of this has been, here's what you can do you, Jill, in order to maybe survive, maybe thrive. The problem with that is that it has shifted the focus away from institutions and systems that really need to do the changing themselves in order to liberate someone like you to show up and be your most authentic self and lead in the way that is most authentic to you. It has also created this sense that a woman is both responsible for her problems in the workplace and responsible for fixing them. That in the well-intended canon of empowerment, that there has been this misunderstanding that now we have all the tools and we have all the answers and we can just fix things for ourselves. And that if we don't, we are then the problem.
Right. I mean, it reminds me of some of the issues around rape culture. You know, women, hold your keys between your fingers and never go walking by yourself and don't wear your hair in a ponytail, yada, yada, yada. Take a self-defense class. And it's the same problem. It's you need to protect yourself. And if you can't, it's your fault then if something happens to you. And there isn't a lot of talk around like, hey, boys and men, learn how to respect women and learn what consent is and maybe don't rape women. And this reminds me of that. I think for now, it's both and, right? That like for now, we can and should try to be making individual changes. And hopefully, as we add those individual changes together, it will move the needle in some ways. But nothing is ever truly going to change at a systemic level unless we see it at a systemic level and address it as a systemic issue. And I think that that's part of where this whole conversation and movement gets stuck, because then it feels so big. It's so overwhelming, right? That like, what am I, Jill, going to do to change sexism? So forget it.
Yeah, totally. Exactly. And I'll say there's nothing worse than being a person who cares about likability, who then writes a book about likability, because what you will end up doing is staying up late at night, reading the reviews of your book, starting with the 1-star reviews. Right? Like, of course, you didn't start with the people who actually loved it. You start with the people who don't like it. And there was a common frustration that I understood. Like, there's sort of like the bogus reviews that just like I can ignore. But then there were the reviews where just like, I just wanted more tips and tricks, essentially. Mm-hmm. And I both fully understood it, and also it was a reminder of what we're up against, that we have become so conditioned to believe that if I just had the right tips and tricks, then I could become the player myself. And it's like, that maybe it's just not that simple. And to your point, if you start thinking about sexism and racism and anything that is structural, then it's just easier to walk away. What I did end up coming to, though, is like, if you harness that energy of what could I do for myself, and you sort of turn it on its head and say, what can I do in the service of other women? That is a better use of your energy, right? So in as much as like language matters, right? If I said to you, well, Jill, she's very indecisive, then you could say, well, is she indecisive or is she deliberate? Because that's the same quality. But if I spin it as a positive and show you the positive element of it, then you're more likely to value Jill than if I tell you that she's indecisive. Same thing with passionate and emotional. I want to work with people who are passionate and emotional, maybe not so much. And that we can say those things for ourselves, but really it's most empowering when you say it for somebody else. When you hear somebody else described in those terms and you take the moment to say, I think you mean she is this positive incarnation of the same trait that you just laid out. Or there was this one piece of advice that I really liked, which is, the vast majority of feedback women get is critical subjective feedback. So that if you are in a review and someone says, Alicia, you're just too aggressive, you say, compared to who? Like, would you say that about Bill in the office? And then the one that I think is even easier to execute is, okay, can you draw a line for me between my style and how it shows up in the results of my work? You have to be open to the possibility that the person can draw a line from your style to the results. And then that is something that you can begin to tackle and work on. But very often it's just someone telling you what they think of you. And that doesn't actually have any bearing on your work. And those tools are great for a person to use in a self-assessment. I also think they're even more powerful when you use them in service of someone else. Right? That if you hear that said about someone else, that you inquire, you poke, you ask what the person really means when they say that, if only to cause reflection. if only to give someone the time and the space to say, you're right. Maybe when I say I don't like that person, what I really mean is we're very, very different. We work very differently. And that is extraordinarily challenging for me.
Right. And I remember you talking in the book too about qualities like helpful, that these things that are disguised as positive words, like, oh, in her review, I call her so helpful, but often helpful, and correct me if any part of this isn't quite right, but, helpful often means, you're doing the office housework of planning the company party or being the mentor to the other women, non-promotable tasks that aren't the things that are getting you raises and moving you up in the company. And then the flip side of that is unhelpful. And what does unhelpful mean? So if I'm doing work that is related to my goals and me moving up in the company, is that selfish? Is that unhelpful? And are women being held to different standards? You don't often hear men being described as helpful or unhelpful.
One thing that came up in a lot of the social science research is that tasks like the printer and taking out the trash, cleaning out the office refrigerator that's very often still fall to people in the office, that if a woman is asked to help with one of those things and she says no, there is a likability penalty. Where a man, there is an expectation that he must just be working on something more important. So of course I'll go ask somebody else. And the helpful thing is a good one. And I will admit it is challenging to change your frame, which is instead of saying she's helpful, tell me what she did. She provided all of the numbers for the quarterly reports. She helped harness the team so that everybody got their pieces into the binder on time. Like, focus on the task. And that it's a muscle that you have to work over and over again, but it's a muscle that can have a big impact in another person's life and career because it shapes the narrative around who they are. Are they a helper or are they a visionary? And that it's a minor difference, but if you can get there, it can have a big impact.
Yeah. I have a quote from you that's related to this that was in an article. And you say, quote, "The constant chatter about how women do their work and how women lead makes it nearly impossible for women to lead in a way that is authentic to them. Rather than reimagining leadership, we're asking women to reimagine themselves." So this, like what we're talking about here, reminds me of that. And the other thing that it made me think of is, are we asking women to be more like men? Like, going back to what we were talking about, individual rather than systemic, we're not asking people in power and systems to change, but also specifically, we're not asking them to recognize the unique qualities that women bring that are what promote better leadership, right? So like the research shows that it's greater diversity that leads to better functioning in organizations, not just giving diverse people a seat at the table, but only if they act like white Western men, right? Like if you look at countries with female leaders that are doing things differently and doing it better. But I think in addition to expecting women to change themselves and do it individually, in many ways, we're also asking them to be more like men.
Yes, I think another way of thinking about it is we give men a very narrow lane in which to run. Even with men, we're saying show up in these hyper masculine, as you said, Western culturally appropriate ways. And the idea is to be more expansive, to imagine, to see warmth as a form of strength.
Yes.
To see the ability to apologize as a form of strength, to see the ability to ask questions to things you don't know as a form of inquiry and intellect and information gathering. And that expanse really happens it happens at an individual level and it happens at an institutional level where there has to, part of it is I've said this and heard other people say it so many times, but you can't be what you can't see. It's true. It's like when you start seeing different forms of leadership, it empowers other people to say, oh, okay, that person was able to show up as they are. And that way is different than I'm accustomed to seeing. And they're succeeding. And so it's not that I have to model the way they are. It's that I am being given permission to be myself and to test out how that works in this time and place.
Yeah, well said. Okay, so I want to back up a little bit and ask you about the title of the book. So it's called The Likeability Trap. And I'm curious how you landed on that particular title. And then I wanted to talk about some of the traps that you talk about in the book. So let's take the title part first, and then I can ask you some of those questions.
Jill, forgive me for not knowing this, but have you written a book?
I've written two, actually.
Okay.
So one is for therapists who do the kind of therapy I do, and then the other one is for women with anxiety, the more recent one. Yeah.
Oh, so both books I need to read.
I'll send you a copy.
So first, I was just going to make a throwaway comment to you, which is finding a title is the worst because you have this thing that you love and you have poured yourself into, and 90% of people will make a snap judgment on it predicated on that title and on, even worse, that subtitle, which is like, if we could just get rid of subtitles, if we could just be like, read the back of the book, you need a whole paragraph,
right.
Much better. I mean, I think the way I originally understood the trap is what I, to your point, outline as trap one, which is the Goldilocks Conundrum: too warm, too cold. A woman, it seems, is never quite right. That women, the cultural expectation is that women will be communal and warm and think about what is in everyone's best interest. And our expectation of a leader is that they will be assertive, driving, and able to advocate for themselves. Those two things are on a collision course, where what we expect of women and what we expect of leaders are diametrically opposed. So that if a woman acts the way we expect a woman to act, people might like her, but they won't see her as a leader. And if women act the way we expect a leader to act, then people may see her as a leader, but they won't like her. And that is particularly complicated because there are so many women like myself who were raised to be ambitious, to want to lead because we do care about the group and we want to help the group achieve a goal. But we were also raised to care about what other people think of us, to care about how we make other people feel, which I think is a good thing. And that manifests in wanting to be well liked. And so to be raised to believe that you could both be ambitious and be well regarded, and then to a bit later find out that those two things may in this moment in our society be mutually exclusive, really messes with your mind. And that to me was the trap. What I realized is that that is one of several traps. I mean, there's this call for authenticity, which seems to really run against everything I just said. Be yourself, do you, but know that if you really show up in that way, you might be penalized for it, or we may decide that you're not a fit. It's especially true for any person of color. It's true for queer people. It's true for anybody who's not in the majority identity in the place that they are working, living. And then the success likability penalties. So I'm going to guess that a lot of people who listen to your podcast have either read Lean In or seen Sheryl Sandberg's TED Talk. And she in the book talks about it in terms of, the more successful a woman becomes, the less likable she becomes. And while there's all this research to back it up, and that is true, I also think it's even more complicated, which is it's not just a one-time decision. Do I want to be successful or do I want to be likable? It's not just once you've reached a certain level of success that you become less likable. It's that every little thing a woman needs to do on the pathway to success makes her less likable. So it is all of these seemingly minor choices that a woman is making that determine whether or not she will be successful and whether or not she'll be likable. So having a really stellar academic record can, for a woman, make a woman less likable or have the perception that she is not fun and not likable. Advocating for a raise, advocating for a better title, advocating to be put on the biggest project. Any of those little things makes a woman look like she's acting in the service of herself. And that then is seen as unladylike. And the woman becomes less likable. And that's to say nothing of all those minor little things that happen in a workplace that you swallow, you put away, you forget about, because you know that if you confronted every microaggression, you would seem like a person who is impossible to work with.
If you're looking for a great way to support us here at Psychologists Off the Clock and make your life easier and healthier, you should go to my new favorite online store, Thrive Market. Thrive Market carries all your grocery and household essentials with the convenience of getting everything online and then quickly shipped right to your door. And right now, you can get 30% off your first order plus a free $60 gift if you go to thrivemarket.com/POTC. I love that I can use specific filters to curate my shopping experience so I can find organic meats and low sugar snacks for my kids. Plus, when you join, they give to a family in need. How cool is that? So join in on the savings with Thrive Market today and get 30% off your first order plus a free $60 gift. Go to thrivemarket.com/POTC for 30% off plus a free $60 gift. That's THRIVE market.com/POTC. thrivemarket.com/POTC.
I know I talk about my kids a lot, but I also have two adorable dogs, Tilly and Hazel. We love to spoil them, which is why we love Whole Life Pet. Whole Life Pet makes single ingredient treats, meal mixers, supplements, and hydrating snacks for both dogs and cats. And if you try out Whole Life Pet, you're surprising your pets with fun new flavors while also supporting Psychologists Off the Clock. Visit wholelifepet.com and use promo code POTC to get 25% off your first order with free shipping over $50. When I open the Tuscan Blend Bistro Bowl meal mixer to add to Tilly and Hazel's food, they start wildly sniffing and can't wait to dig in. The best part is Whole Life Pet uses a freeze-dried process that locks in nutrients and freshness, and they never add chemicals, additives, preservatives, or anything artificial. Visit wholelifepet.com and use promo code POTC to get 25% off your first order with free shipping over $50. If you're unsure about what to try, you can fill out their short questionnaire by clicking the red Start Today button on the home page. It will ask you a few questions and make custom product recommendations for your pets. Visit wholelifepet.com and use promo code POTC to get 25% off today.
Mm-hmm. Right. And I see it play out even outside of the workplace. It's so pervasive. You know, I've had this personal experience. I actually wrote a blog about the book and about some of these experiences where I have a book that came out in January, and I was sharing my successes just with my family initially because I didn't want it out on social media because I was afraid that it would look like I was not being humble and that it would make me unlikable, that I'm bragging. But I figured, of course, it would be safe to share with my dad and my brother. And at one point, my dad asked me, very concerned, "Do you think sharing these successes might make your brother feel bad?" And it was coming from this very well-intentioned place because my brother had been having a hard time. And likewise, my husband also sort of like, he was mad at me for something unrelated and kind of lashed out. But he made a comment about like, all I ever think about is my book and my podcast. And I mean, it was this just whoa in your face personal example of like, even inside my own family, sharing success is not a likable trait. And oh my God, it hurt so bad. And I don't think they even realize it. You know, if I pointed this out to them as part of one of these kind of likability traps, I think they would be shocked, right? And it's, you know, I don't even know how to make that conscious for people. And, you know, one of the things I was thinking about is like, is there maybe a bridge between this individual responsibility for changing things and this systemic change? Where if we think about the people who tend to have the power, who might be more likely to move the needle with systemic issues, it's whoever is in the majority group. And in much the same way, I hope it seems like we're moving the needle with racial justice because white people are getting involved finally, right? I think we need men and people in power to buy into this as an issue and to get involved. I even had the thought that maybe borrowing from the racial justice movement, that we may need to change the word feminism because it is so loaded. It is so loaded. People hate that word. And, you know, my dad said to me jokingly, he said, "Don't call me a feminist." And I said, "Well, do you believe that men and women should have equality?" And he said, "Of course." And I said, "Well, then you're a feminist. What do you think a feminist is?" And that maybe we need to start calling it anti-sexist. Because I think most men I know would say, of course I'm anti-sexist, and then might be more willing to jump into the fight. And, you know, I think one or two of the blogs I've written, one specifically, I wrote two men, like two fathers of daughters, in this desperate plea of like, how, no one can see me right now, but I'm doing fists like I'm shaking someone, like, how can I make you care about this? How can I make you see that this is an issue and we need your help? We need you to jump in here and be part of the solution. Well, maybe if I talk to you as a father of a daughter, then maybe you'll care.
Except it was your dad who told you that you were being immodest.
Yeah, I know. And that's when I read the book, I'll admit I had this dual, I felt sad and discouraged and oh, how are we ever going to change this? But also hopeful. But I think this is where we get stuck exactly what you're saying is so what do we do if we're making a mistake by putting the onus on women individually, but it feels so hard to change things systemically. What do we do? Where can we start? What is that bridge?
And that's where I also think there is it's funny the example you give, because the example you give is where the personal and the professional intersect, right? That it was your dad talking to you about your work product. I think there are two different answers, which is I think when you talk about work, so much of it is about finding a workplace that really values you, that allows you to show up at yourself, where your successes are seen as successes for the group and then are lauded. You and I are in very individualistic things, and I think that becomes complicated, even though you and I would see them as forms of service to the group. But in your personal life, it's where I have become more radicalized, which is that if you are going to spend 40 to 60 hours at work, and work is always going to require some measure of performance, then in your personal life, you really want to edit down to the people with whom you feel you can be most yourself, who understand you, understand your motivations, and are just rooting you on. That doesn't mean those people can't have real talk with you, and that sometimes you might be annoying or dismissive or, any of the things you already don't like about yourself, but you may be, and you want the people who can call you out on that stuff too. But that in general, you want people with whom you feel you can show up as yourself. What I hear, though, in the specific example that I'm now obsessed with of you and your dad, is that there also is a misunderstanding of how self-promotion, when you are doing something like writing a book or putting a product out into the world, isn't about being self-congratulatory. It's a part of the work. It's part of what you have signed up for. It is part of the commitment that you have made to your publisher, to your book agent, to the audience that you are trying to reach. It's great to write a book, but really you're sharing a message, and you are actively trying to get that message out to as many people as possible because you believe that it can change hearts, minds, and lives. And so I would have taken that so personally. That is somewhere between the just breakdown, cry, and saying not nice words. But if I were in my most aligned, rational space, I would hope that I could say, I totally hear that you think it could affect my brother. I will be sure to check in with him more generally. But I would also hope that you can understand that this is a necessary component of my work. And this is more reflection on the work itself and what is necessary in order to get it done. And it is on me. But
yeah,
those
that's
two
great.
Become so entangled.
They do. Well, and I think because I did have a strong emotional response, I shut down and I didn't say anything. And instead I wrote an article about it, right? It's I'm going to do what I do and I'm having a lot of feelings. I'm going to write about it to manage my feelings, but I didn't address the problem, the source of the problem. And I really should have, because, I know we're still just talking about one person and it happens to be my dad, but I've also seen evidence where having those conversations is effective. So for example, he said to me at one point, my dad is a Republican and I am not. And he said to me at one point, I guess the Obamas purchased a home in Hawaii. And he said, how can Barack Obama, was what he meant, how can Obama afford a $15 million home in Hawaii, Maui, wherever it was? And I said, well, Dad, his wife, Michelle, wrote the biggest selling memoir of all time and got a $15 million advance. So perhaps that's how the Obama family can afford a $15 million home. And he sort of was like, oh, right? You could see that it just never occurred to him. And then he did the exact same thing talking about a friend of mine. How can he afford this house on a lake? What does he do that he can afford it? And I said, Well, Dad, his wife, insert name here, I won't out them on the podcast, but, she does this and that and sold this patent. And so perhaps it has to do with her that they can afford that home. And I said, Dad, that's the second time you've done that. And, he stopped and thought and he said, oh my gosh, you're right. I'm like, see how insidious these biases are that you just automatically go to the assumption that a person can afford a home based on the male income. And he really got it. He really got it. And so I do think, it's not our job as women to educate every other male and female, all of the other people out there about these biases. But when we have the opportunity to call someone in and talk about it, I do think it's important to do that, even though it's not easy.
Your dad got a lot of airtime today. I hope he likes this podcast.
I know he did. My family doesn't tend to read what I write or listen to my podcast. So.
Phenomenal. Yes. I don't want to hyper focus, but it's also so funny. It's like, okay, so I'm not going to share my accomplishment and that's going to make everyone else feel better. How? So now it's like, now we've just stymied everyone. Like now, it's not like there's like someone's now winning. It's like,
right.
No one's winning.
Yeah. I had this other, this is what just popped in my head. I don't know if it's related to what we were just saying, but I had this other sort of aha moment after I read the book, and specifically the Goldilocks Conundrum, where I grew up, where my mom and I had this like complicated relationship, and she would be critical of my weight when my weight was too high. Right? But then I would lose weight and she would feel very threatened by that. Right? So I spent all this time trying to find that perfect box where I was neither too hot nor too cold, but I was just right. And I never got there. No amount of therapy or trying, I never got there. And my mom passed away a few years ago before I read the book, but I read this book and had this aha moment. And it actually allowed me to like really forgive her, because what it made me realize is like, oh my God, like this wasn't just her she wasn't trying to be mean or like being a bad mom. Like she was raised in a culture where this Goldilocks conundrum plays out for women all the time. And I think this is a way that like she too internalized these biases and then put them on me. And just having that realization like really allowed me to let go of a big piece of that.
Thank you. Thank you, because I feel like sometimes when you're writing a book, you feel like you're screaming into a void and you hope that somebody hears it on their side. So I'm glad that it made that connection for you. And one of the things, there are a few things I regret just not interrogating more. One of them was weight, or just body image. The other one was age. I didn't really think enough about ageism. I think in part because the older women I was talking to had, were successful. That was why I was talking to them. And so they weren't seeing age through the same lens as someone who might, be in middle management or, might be contending with it in a different way in the workplace. To your point about weight, I remember I have oscillated in my weight my entire life. And I was at my grandmother's funeral, sort of on the receiving line 10 years ago. And it was a parade of people who it felt like every other person was like, you've lost weight, you've gained weight, you've lost weight, you gained weight. And in some ways, I felt very empowered and had so much clarity on the moment. It was like, oh, this is also a subjective thing. Like how you are seeing or responding to my body has actually so much more to do with you than it has to do with me. Because I'm standing here and I am the same weight moment to moment in which we're having this conversation. And yet I was told that I was both too thin and had like thickened up in the same.
Right.
And that is where I think it is also the same, which is like, you're so often dealing with other people's perceptions, and where it becomes a challenge is when it changes your perception of yourself.
Yeah, totally. And just, an added layer to that is like, why do people think that they can comment on women's bodies? And I guarantee whatever men were standing in that line were probably not having comments made about their weight or shape or size or facial expression or, one of the other things that as I was reading the book and going, oh my gosh, like this and this and this and all these things that have happened is, I think my first really obvious memory of this was in graduate school when I got yelled at for laughing too loud. And then within a few days, the same person told me I needed to smile more. And it almost feels like gaslighting. I mean, it is that Goldilocks, like too hot, too cold. Like there's nowhere I can be. There's nothing I can, the way I look, the way I speak, the way I emote, like there's no just right.
And it has become even more complicated because while you are a public person, I am a public person. Like if you have a Twitter account, you're a public person now. If you have a public facing Instagram account, you're a public person now, where there is just more feedback. And so it's not like you just have this universe of your nuclear family, maybe a few neighbors, maybe a few friends. And those are the people that you are wondering, well, what did they think of this lipstick or whatever? It's like now there is just this expansive universe of maybe Russian bots, maybe real people who want to weigh in. And then it's like, then you are in a real fun house where you're dealing with the opinions of people you don't know, may never meet, and who will never meet you. Like I'm having the loveliest time, Jill. We could meet in person and this just could not be a thing. You know what I mean? Like I could sit down because I'm now going to buy the book on women and anxiety, and I could read it and be like, nah. And like that's, if I had only known that piece of you, I would have an incomplete picture. And it is so easy now to have an incomplete picture of someone based on limited interactions or limited exposure, and to have the misperception that you have a full picture.
Yeah, that's a
good
point.
I follow her on Instagram. I know her.
Yeah.
I didn't post anything from my second pregnancy on Instagram because I was in the middle of trying to get a job. So I kept it off of social media, and then sort of had a picture of me and my baby in the hospital bed. And people were like, what? like not about, like, they didn't care about me. It was like, how could I not know this?
How could you have not told me?
Yes.
Like, I feel entitled that you as a public person should have shared this with me. Yes. And how sad that you felt you couldn't if you wanted to, because women are discriminated against for being mothers.
And at some point it became like an element of performance art to me, which is like, none of this is real. None of this is the complete picture. Like everybody is doing some form of editing. Like it doesn't have to be a literal filter or a literal edit. It's like you are picking and choosing which moments of your life you share. That is editing. Yeah. And we're comparing ourselves to others based on those edits.
Right. The highlight reel. And in truth, that's not really what people want to see. Like, yes, of course, there are those trolls out there that are just dying to throw insults your way. But for like the rest of the just good-hearted people out there, I recently posted on Instagram some of my bad reviews for my book, and which felt really vulnerable and like, oh God, what am I doing? And of course, there were lots of people who responded to that as like, oh my God, thank you. There's something about that, like, hey, look, here I am, a real flawed human being who has struggles and et cetera. And that means we're the same, right? That common humanity that like, we are all human beings who are struggling and trying to manage during these crazy times. And no one's highlight reel is genuinely the real picture. And the thing that makes us feel connected to one another is that struggle that we all share, those imperfections.
I was reading a bad review the other day that was like just very fair, where it was basically like this book was fine. It just didn't do anything for me. And I was surprised to see all of the really good reviews. And you almost wish you could write back to like, I'm so sorry it didn't land. Like, I wish I could send you a refund because it just seems like this just wasn't a fit. And I feel bad about that. But I went down a deep dark hole. And so in order to pull myself out of it, I started reading bad reviews of books I loved to remind myself that it was subjective. And my favorite one that I found was one book where the review was like, this book came to me 3 days late and the cover was dirty. And I was like, oh, that's right. This person's reviewing it as a product. Like they're not assessing it as Alicia the person or Jill the person. Right. It feels that way. But it's like she was actually more concerned with like the binding of the book.
Right.
Than she was with the ideas in it. And that somehow that just like lit me up.
It liberates you. Yeah. Well, speaking a little bit of motherhood and hard times, I know we're about to run out of time here, but I did want to take a few minutes to talk about how some of these gender issues and biases are playing out either the same or differently in this, crazy new context we're all living in. What are your thoughts?
I am going to give the necessary disclaimer, which is there are a lot of families and there are a lot of mothers right now who are out of work. And so they are worrying about how to keep their family safe from a raging virus and how they're going to put food on the table. And that is a failure of leadership and government that has to be reckoned with. And then there are the women like you and me who are lucky and have jobs that have continued to pay us. And we also have kids at home. So that is to me, a secondary reality. There's all of the obvious stuff obvious to me around the fact that we've now had to be much more transparent about our time and putting boundaries and limits on our times in both directions. So this is where the personal and the professional crash once again, which is you both with your partner, if you have a partner, with your children need to be these are the hours where mommy works and where there cannot be interruptions. And you have to do it at work too, where you say, I'm available during these windows by phone. I'm available during these windows by email. If you need me to finish that, it will be done tonight. But there are just some realities of confines on my time that I can no longer mask because I no longer have the type of childcare that would allow me to do that. But I think there is a more amorphous thing that I would love to talk about with you because you seem so uniquely qualified to talk about it, which is an ambivalence around ambition and a lack of clarity around how appropriate it is to be ambitious in this moment, where it just becomes a tax on the self, right? An old way of operating, right? I'm a mega ambitious person. I don't know how much sense it means to be ambitious and to set the bar there in this moment. It feels like a thing that is deeply unkind to myself, to trying to do all the things I was doing before and clear all of those accomplishments. On the flip, it also feels like it would be unkind to myself not to be striving, because otherwise, I think we went into this and we thought, well, maybe if they do all the right things, it'll be a few weeks, then a few months. Now you have Google saying people aren't going to return to work until June 2021. So as we really settle into the reality of how long this is going to be, it also doesn't seem feasible to put all of these ambitions and dreams on the back burner. And so I feel like I personally have like a low grade malaise and also a different anxiety than my day-to-day anxiety, which is just I can't quite land on the answer.
Mm-hmm. I know exactly what you're talking about. And what I find myself wondering is if part of this is that it's become more difficult to compartmentalize the part of us that is a parent and the part of us that is a professional. And of course, these things aren't compartmentalized. We are both of these things at all times, but under normal circumstances, we are at work and we are doing work and we are working. And then we stop working and we are parents. And right now we're all the things all the time. And one of the things I've noticed just in my small circle of women I know is many typically ambitious go-getting women are working less, cutting hours, taking a complete break from work, and are very, they're ambivalent about it. They're just what you're saying, I want to keep working and being ambitious and doing these things, and I need to be a good mom, and I can't figure out how to do both of those things. So I can't not choose my kids. And what I think is the most glaring issue inside of that is if you're a single parent, this is a completely different conversation. But assuming that this child has another parent in the mix, where is that person? A colleague of mine recently chose to leave her job, and I know for a fact that if she worked in this job full time, she would make a very good amount of money. So which of the parents decides to stop working and stay with the kids had nothing to do with finances. And as far as I know, there was never any conversation that maybe dad would be the one to stay home and be in charge while mom continued to ambitiously pursue her career. And I think that's that kind of cultural piece is And we're all doing it. We're all colluding. There's just this sort of assumption that the onus is on the moms in these situations. And partly as moms because we want it to be in some ways, right? Like it's complicated. I don't know what the answer is, but I think that that's part of what the challenge is.
I'm shaking my head because it is wildly complicated, and it is both. You run up against all of the cultural pieces you said, and then there are also individual choices. I think that there are a lot of women who want to do it. I also, though, have a friend who's very clear that she would prefer to work than to caretake for her children. Mm-hmm. She has complete clarity around that. And her clarity actually held up to me a mirror where I had to contend with my own ambivalence, that I both really love working, I also love being with my kids. And that complicates the picture, because I want to be in both places. I want to do both things, and I want to do them well. And I had finally gotten to a place where I had, like the Tetris figured out so that the pieces fit as best as possible. And it was still wacky. And my house is, I should pick up the Zoom and show you the laundry basket that is sitting on the floor. Like it's messy, but it works. And then it feels like this has all forced us to re-establish it, and not just establish the caretaking, establish the routine, but establish those conversations around who works, whose time is valued, how is that time valued, whose career is seen as the most important. And to further complicate it, because it's not always tied to who makes the most income. Right. It's not just that neat. That's what you're raising, is that it's not someone said, okay, well, you make $20 and I make $10. So clearly the person who makes $20 should be the one who goes and works. It's like there is an ephemera around it. Mm-hmm. That is sometimes not spoken about.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think the other kind of ambivalence piece of I love working and I love being with my kids is, at least for me, it used to be the case that I would be working during the day and I would go pick my kids up at kids care, and they had so much fun in their after school program that they would see me and be like, "Aw, what are you doing here? I don't want you here."
Best feeling in the world for me personally.
Best feeling, because it allays that mom guilt immediately. Like, oh, they're having way more fun here than they would at home, so it's all good. Now, there's none of that. They're on screens way more than they should be, because what other option is there, especially if you have kids who are too young to be out running around the neighborhood on their own. But now it's constantly coming in saying, "Mommy, will you play a game with me?" And having to say no is so incredibly painful. And having to find a way, how can I do my job and say yes as much as possible? And I think all of that, just the emotion that comes with that is part of what has made it, it's not as easy to accept and let go as it was before. I think before we were all home together all the time. Right. I will say one of the, it's been a few years, but I have worked very hard at having an equal distribution of labor in my home. And that was absolutely not the case initially. Right. And that has helped so much to have a partner who does dishes and does laundry, and that if I'm here recording and he's out there, I know that the kids will go to him. I was drowning at one point. I'm somebody who can juggle a hell of a lot of balls. I even joke, even if the balls are on fire, but I got to the point where they came crashing down. And, I had to beg my partner to get on board with this. And it took a lot of really difficult and emotional conversations. But we did get there. And I think, I'm bringing this up now because I know there are a lot of other women who struggle with this. And I think the key is you can't give up. It's so tempting when things feel too big, like we were talking about before, to just stick your head back in the sand and just go about your regular life. But if you're willing to keep having these painful conversations, I
can hear your kids. They gave you to 131. I love where you were going with that, though, which is you do have, I had the same moment where it's step back, look at this, do design thinking, what is, understand the problem, come up with every possible solution. And it's I was getting so trapped in a binary of my choices to work or to not to work, mm-hmm. or my choices to wake up early and do my work or not. And it's no, come up, it should not be on women individually to have to figure out these solutions, but since we are here and that is where we often find ourselves, it is worth the time and effort to understand at least what can change.
Right. I think it can't be the only solution, but it must be part of the solution.
Right.
Okay.
They're done.
Well,
they're like,
yeah, I know.
Mom, I am so good.
The kids apparently have been watching the clock, so we will go ahead and wrap up there. So thank you, Alicia, so much for spending the time. This was such a meaningful
wonderful
conversation for me, and I really appreciate it.
I appreciate you. Thank you, Jill.
Thank you for listening to Psychologists Off the Clock. If you enjoy our podcast, you can help us out by leaving a review or contributing on Patreon.
You can find us wherever you get your podcasts, and you can connect with us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
We'd like to thank our interns, Dr. Catherine Foley-Saldana and Dr. Katie Lear.
This podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes only and is not meant to be a substitute for mental health treatment. If you're having a mental health emergency, dial 911. If you're looking for mental health treatment, please visit the resources page of our webpage, offtheclockpsych.com.